No one believed him when he said the bear remembered him until they saw what she led him to. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful tales of nature and survival. Thank you. Let's get back to the story now. Jacob Whitlow wasn't the kind of man who went looking for trouble, especially not after the kind of life he'd led. In his early 50s, with weathered hands and a lined, tired face, Jacob had long since traded the noise of the city for the silence of the wilderness. His small wooden cabin, nestled on the edge of the Alaskan wilderness, was a monument to solitude. No cell service, no internet, just snow, pine trees, and the occasional moose. He called it peace. But truthfully, it was an escape. It had been years since he'd spoken to his brother, Tyler. Their last words were spoken during a hunting trip that had gone horribly wrong. A stray shot, a panicked animal, and a tragedy that had changed Jacob forever. Tyler didn't make it home that day. And Jacob, though he returned, was never the same. He sold his home, left his job, and disappeared into the trees, where no one asked questions and no one gave answers. Most mornings in the woods were uneventful. Jacob would rise early, chop some wood, sip coffee from a dented thermos, and take long walks to check his traps, not for killing, but for photographing. After giving up hunting, he'd taken to wildlife photography. It was a quiet way to stay connected to the creatures he once pursued, but now revered. On this particular morning, the air was unusually still. The snow, thick and fresh from an overnight storm, blanketed the forest floor in a white hush. Even the wind seemed to pause. Jacob zipped up his parka, grabbed his camera bag, and stepped out into the cold. His breath curled into the air like smoke as he walked, boots crunching against the snow. He had planned on heading east toward the Riverbend Trail, but something tugged at his instinct, an uneasy feeling in his gut. Instead, he veered northwest, toward a seldom-used path choked with brambles and old fir trees. The deeper he walked, the more the silence pressed in around him. And then he heard it. A low, painful sound, like a groan dragged over gravel. Jacob froze. There it was again, a whimper, muffled and broken. Not human. Not quite like a dog, either. His pulse quickened. He slowly removed his glove, reaching for the small hunting knife strapped to his belt. He didn't use it for killing anymore, but out here, it was still a necessity. Following the sound, he crept carefully, weaving between trees until he spotted a disturbance in the snow ahead. And there, just past a ridge, half hidden beneath fallen branches, he saw her. A massive grizzly bear. Her fur was thick but matted with blood around her back leg. A steel hunting trap had clamped down on her limb, jagged teeth biting deep into the muscle. The metal was slick with ice and crimson, and she was barely conscious, her great body heaving, nostrils flaring with each breath. One of her eyes was swollen shut, and the other flickered toward Jacob, full of pain but not rage. His first instinct was to back away slowly, to avoid sudden movements. But something in the way the bear looked at him made him stop. There was no threat in her eyes, only exhaustion. Only surrender. He could have left. He could have turned around and pretended he hadn't seen a thing. But Jacob's heart clenched at the sight of her suffering. A memory surged, his brother, bleeding on the forest floor, eyes wide with shock and fear. And Jacob, paralyzed by his own disbelief. He had frozen then. He wouldn't freeze now. Cautiously, he stepped closer. Easy now, he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. I'm not here to hurt you. The bear didn't move. She was too far gone to run, too weak to lash out. The snow around her leg was stained with rust-colored ice. Jacob crouched nearby, analyzing the trap. It was old, one of those illegal spring-jaw types hunters weren't supposed to use anymore. The teeth were cruel, curved in a way that ensured deep punctures with every twitch. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small multi-tool. His hands trembled, more from emotion than the cold. It took him a few minutes to find the locking mechanism and another few to loosen the jaws without causing more damage. All the while, he whispered gently to the bear, not because he expected her to understand, but because he needed to calm himself. With one final twist, the trap's jaws released. The bear let out a guttural groan and tried to move. Her leg buckled beneath her, but she didn't attack. Instead, she collapsed fully onto the snow, eyes fluttering closed. Jacob backed away slowly, keeping his gaze steady, never turning his back. He knew better than to assume the danger was gone. But the bear didn't rise. She was too weak. Jacob stood there for several moments, heart pounding, adrenaline crashing through his system. He had just released a wounded predator, something most people would call insanity. But he didn't feel fear. He felt something deeper, a kind of aching empathy that came from years of guilt, years of regret. Eventually, he turned and walked away. Back at his cabin, Jacob couldn't stop thinking about her. He made tea, stoked the fire, and sat in his old rocking chair, but his thoughts kept returning to that bleeding bear in the snow. He had done something reckless, maybe even stupid, but he didn't regret it. Before nightfall, he packed a small bag, bandages, antiseptic spray, some raw fish from his freezer, and walked back to the ridge. When he arrived, she was still there, though barely conscious. He approached carefully, laying the food near her snout and spraying a light mist of antiseptic over the wound. The bear stirred but didn't rise. Her breathing was steadier now, though labored. Jacob stayed for nearly an hour, just watching, listening to the sound of her breath. And before he left, he whispered again, "You're going to be okay. You hear me? You're not alone out here." It was a ridiculous thing to say, but somehow it felt right. The snow began to fall again as he returned to the cabin, this time heavier. The kind of snow that muffled sound and erased footprints by morning. Jacob didn't sleep well that night. He dreamed of his brother, of gunshots echoing through trees, of bleeding things that could not be saved. But in that dream, something new appeared, a bear's eyes, dark and glistening, watching him from the tree-line with something like understanding. He awoke before dawn, unsure whether it had been a nightmare or a promise. Either way, something had changed. And neither Jacob nor the bear knew just how deeply that moment in the snow would transform both of their lives. Morning came slowly, smothered in gray. Snow had fallen thick and silent through the night, burying the forest in a heavy blanket that clung to trees and softened every edge of the world. Jacob's cabin groaned under the weight of it, the roof sagging slightly from the overnight accumulation. Inside, the fire was still glowing, but Jacob had barely slept. He sat at the edge of his bed, boots half-laced, staring into the dim morning light pouring through the frosted window. His mind was still tangled with what had happened the day before. He could still see her massive and wild and bleeding. The weight of her suffering sat heavily on his chest, like an invisible wound he couldn't clean or stitch shut. And yet, despite every primal warning in his body, he wasn't afraid of her. Not truly. He stepped outside, the cold biting at his face, and looked toward the tree line. All was still. No tracks. No movement. Just white. He half expected her to be gone, maybe limping her way deeper into the woods to die alone, the way so many wild creatures do. But something told him she hadn't gone far. Jacob went about his usual morning tasks, splitting logs, clearing the path from his door, boiling water for tea, but his focus kept slipping. Every sound in the distance pulled at him like a whisper. Eventually, he gave in. He packed up another small bag, more raw fish, a water jug, some cloth. He grabbed his camera out of habit, though he didn't plan to use it. Today wasn't about capturing moments. It was about bearing witness. The trek back to where he had found her was slower today. The snow was deeper, his boots sinking past the ankle. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees like voices. But when he reached the ridge, the space where she had been was empty. Only a bloodstain remained, half covered by fresh powder. The trap was still there, lying twisted and useless on the ground like a relic from some dark ritual. But the bear was gone. He turned slowly, scanning the forest. Nothing. Maybe she made it, he muttered aloud, though even he didn't know if he believed it. Jacob made his way back to the cabin, his steps heavier this time. Part of him had hoped to see her again, not just to confirm she was alive, but because something about her had awakened a piece of himself he thought was long dead. A need to care, to protect, to do something that mattered. Back at the cabin, he tossed another log onto the fire and sat down with his tea. Hours passed. Snow continued to fall outside. He tried to read an old paperback by the fireplace, but he couldn't concentrate. He kept glancing at the window, at the door, at the snow. Listening. Waiting. Then, just as twilight began to settle and the forest turned that eerie shade of blue that only comes in winter, he heard it. A scraping, followed by a thump. Then something brushing against the cabin wall. Jacob shot up, knocking his mug onto the floor. The tea spread in a steaming puddle, ignored. He moved slowly toward the front door, heart pounding. He reached for the latch, but he didn't open it. Instead, he stepped to the side window and carefully drew back the curtain. There she was, not at the edge of the forest, not down the ridge. She was on his porch. The bear, massive and wounded, stood just feet from his door. Snow clung to her fur in clumps. Her breathing was labored but steady, and in her mouth, dangling gently from her jaws, was something small. Jacob squinted, disbelief blooming in his chest. A rabbit. A fresh kill. She dropped it gently onto the porch, like an offering. Jacob's breath caught. He didn't move. The bear didn't either. She simply looked at the door, her ears low, her body still. After a long pause, she turned slowly and limped down the steps, vanishing into the growing dusk. Jacob stood frozen for several minutes before finally opening the door. The wind hit him like a slap, but he didn't care. He stepped outside, snow crunching underfoot, and stared at the small, motionless body of the rabbit. Its fur was barely dusted with snow. It hadn't been dead long. He picked it up slowly, gently. The gesture wasn't lost on him. Was it thanks? A gift? A signal? It didn't matter. What mattered was that a wounded, wild grizzly, one of the most dangerous animals on the continent, had chosen to return to him, had brought something instead of taking, had approached instead of fled. He cleaned the rabbit, not for himself, but because the act felt sacred. Like accepting a message, however primal, deserved respect. He didn't eat it. He buried it beneath the snow, near the edge of the forest, where the trees met the clearing. A gesture for a gesture. That night, Jacob sat by the fire and thought about the moment in ways he didn't have words for. The wilderness had always been something to endure, something that demanded respect and distance. But now it felt like something else, like it had eyes, like it had chosen him. The next morning, he found fresh tracks in the snow, larger ones and smaller ones too. Cubs. There were cubs. She hadn't just been wandering. She hadn't just been surviving. She had been trying to protect her young. And something in him shifted. This wasn't over. Something was beginning. And Jacob knew, without understanding how, that this bear would come again. Not because she needed help, but because something unspoken had passed between them. A thread pulled tight between species, bound by pain, stitched with trust. And it had only just begun. The morning sun peeked over the treetops like a shy guest, hesitant to warm a world still frozen in silence. Jacob woke early, stirred by a restlessness that had become a companion over the past 2 days. He hadn't slept well, not because of fear, but because something had shifted inside him. Some invisible hinge had swung open, and now every sound in the forest, every creak in the wood of his cabin, every hush in the wind, felt like a whisper begging to be heard. He pulled on his boots, the leather stiff from the cold, and stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath him, thick and powdery. A silence stretched across the trees, almost sacred. But he noticed something immediately: tracks. Not the ones left by deer or foxes that sometimes circled his cabin in search of scraps. These were big, wider than his boots, deep, despite the fresh snowfall, and trailing beside them smaller prints. Softer, more scattered, wobbly like a toddler's first steps. Cubs. Jacob crouched down, brushing snow gently away to study the trail more closely. The mother's steps were deliberate, slow, each one spaced evenly. The cub's prints darted and overlapped, one veering closer to the cabin before curving back behind her. They'd been close, very close. He followed the tracks slowly, past the porch where the rabbit had been laid like a tribute, down the gentle slope behind the cabin, and toward the edge of the forest. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches burdened with snow, dripping faintly as the sunlight worked to melt the edges. The trail wound between the trees like a ribbon, an elegant line through the untouched white. Jacob moved carefully, quietly. Each step into the woods felt less like trespassing and more like answering a call. About 20 minutes in, the path opened into a small clearing. And there, nestled beneath a fallen pine and a drift of snow, was a hollowed-out nook. Not quite a den, more like an improvised shelter. Twigs had been dragged inward, leaves layered for insulation. The snow around the entrance had been packed down by heavy bodies. Inside, Jacob saw remnants of fur, tufts left behind like ghosts. The family had taken shelter here, but they were gone now. He stood there for several minutes, breathing deeply, letting the silence speak. He could feel them, not just their presence, but their will, their endurance, their desperation. This wasn't just a search for food or warmth. It was survival of the purest kind, fierce, maternal, raw. And for the first time, Jacob understood something that had haunted him since she'd first appeared. She had approached him not because she was weak. She had approached him because she had run out of time. Her wound had not healed. Her breath had been shallow. She was dying. But she hadn't stopped fighting, not for herself, but for the 2 lives following in her shadow. And now, she had returned to his cabin not to thank him, but to trust him, to pass on something sacred. The weight of that realization nearly dropped Jacob to his knees. He looked down at the ground, at the scattered claw marks and paw prints of the cubs, and suddenly remembered a moment from his childhood. His father, long gone now, had once told him that when wild animals approach humans, it isn't weakness. It's intuition. Some creatures know when they've run out of options, and they gamble on the one thing that might save them. Not because they want to, because they must. That evening, Jacob prepared his cabin differently. He cleared space by the fire, laid down 2 of the thicker blankets from his bed, left a bowl of water near the hearth, and set out some cooked salmon from his stores. He didn't know if it was safe. He didn't know if it was right. But he did know it felt necessary. The forest outside grew dark. The winds rose again, shaking the trees like ancient bones rattling. The fire crackled, flickering shadows against the walls. Jacob sat near the window, staring out at the path he'd shoveled just the day before. And then, softly, like a sigh, there was movement. 2 shapes emerged from the shadows. Tiny, clumsy, but unmistakably alive. The cubs. Alone. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. They were smaller than he remembered, their fur patchy in places, their eyes wide and scanning. One limped slightly. The other squeaked as it stepped over a branch, as if unsure of the world beneath its feet. Jacob stood slowly, heart thudding. He opened the door just enough for the light from inside to spill onto the snow. The cubs paused, sniffed. One took a cautious step forward, then another. And then, as if drawn by memory or scent or some primal knowing, they approached. The cabin. The warmth. The man who had helped their mother. Jacob stepped back, leaving the door wide open. He didn't move as the cubs stepped cautiously over the threshold, their tiny paws leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. They sniffed at the fire, nudged the blanket, and then collapsed together in a trembling heap, curling instinctively into each other. Jacob dropped to his knees, overwhelmed. He didn't touch them. He didn't dare. But he sat near them, quiet, still, a silent guardian to the final gift their mother had entrusted to him. Because that's what it was. Her last choice. Her last hope. And he had been chosen. He didn't know what would come next. He only knew one thing. He wouldn't let them face the world alone. Not now. Not ever. The storm returned that night, howling like a wounded beast through the trees, bending branches with icy fury and sweeping curtains of snow across the frozen ground. But inside the cabin, there was warmth. Not just from the crackling fire, but from the quiet rhythm of 2 small hearts beating beside it. Jacob had barely moved since the cubs entered his home. He sat across from them, silent, his coffee cooling untouched on the table beside him. Every time he tried to look away, his gaze was pulled back, drawn to the gentle rise and fall of their tiny sides, the twitch of their ears, the soft whimpering sounds they made in their sleep, like they were dreaming of their mother. She hadn't returned. He'd left the door ajar for hours, even stood on the porch beneath the biting wind, calling softly into the night, his breath steaming in the air like smoke signals to the stars. But there had been no response. No crunch of paws in the snow. No low rumble of breath. No eyes reflecting in the darkness. She was gone. Whether she had succumbed to her injuries somewhere deep in the forest or simply slipped back into the wild to die in peace, Jacob couldn't know. But her absence was as loud as thunder in his chest. Still, he didn't cry. Not yet. The cubs needed him. Over the next few days, the world outside remained locked in winter's grasp. Snow fell constantly, sometimes gently like ash from the sky, sometimes in great gusting swirls that buried the porch and erased the tracks Jacob had shoveled by hand. The trees sagged under the weight of the storm. The lake vanished beneath a solid sheet of ice. But inside, something remarkable was unfolding. Trust. At first, the cubs stayed close to the hearth. They huddled together, wary and silent, barely moving except to sniff the air or press their noses against each other's fur. Jacob kept his distance, always moving slowly, always speaking softly when he needed to refill their water or place down food. He never reached toward them, never made sudden movements. He knew trust was something that couldn't be forced. It had to grow, like a seed in winter soil, patient and quiet. On the 3rd night, something changed. As Jacob sat cross-legged across the room, gently reading aloud from an old, worn novel, not because he expected them to understand, but because his voice might soothe them, he felt a light pressure against his knee. One of the cubs. The smaller one. Its nose was wet, its fur still clinging to flakes of melted snow, and its wide, dark eyes blinked up at him like questions carved into velvet. Jacob didn't move. He just smiled. And then, incredibly, the cub curled up against his leg. That moment broke something open inside him. He didn't weep loudly, didn't sob. But a single tear traced a path down his cheek, warm and stinging, as he reached out, not to pet, but to simply rest his hand nearby. Not touching, just close enough to offer presence. It wasn't just about the bear anymore. It was about connection, healing, life moving forward in the most unexpected way. By the end of the week, the cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a home. Jacob adapted his routine entirely. He cooked extra portions of food, small bits of fish, mashed root vegetables, softened berries, placing them carefully in separate bowls. He insulated the corners of the room to keep out the draft. He patted the area near the fire with folded towels and laid a quilt over the pile, forming a makeshift den. And at night, when the wind screamed and the cabin creaked under the pressure of ice, he would sit nearby and hum softly old songs his mother used to sing, long forgotten until now. He named them, though he knew he shouldn't. The bigger one he called Bran, strong and a little stubborn. He liked to bat at Jacob's boots and once stole a sock, dragging it across the room like a prize. The smaller one, the one who'd curled up to him first, he named Mira, after the Latin word for miracle. Because that's what she was. A tiny, trembling life that had somehow survived hunger, storms, and grief, and still had enough courage left to trust a man. But for every joyful moment inside the cabin, Jacob knew the outside world waited with questions and consequences. These were wild animals. He wasn't a trained rescuer. He wasn't part of any wildlife organization. And he certainly wasn't prepared for what might happen when spring came, and the bears grew stronger, bolder, needing more space. But he also knew one thing. They had no one else. And after what their mother had done, after the sheer she'd shown dragging herself to his porch, bleeding and exhausted, just to leave them somewhere safe, Jacob couldn't just abandon them. Not now. He made a few discreet calls. First to a wildlife rehabilitation center 2 counties over. He didn't give his name, just asked questions. Hypotheticals. What should someone do if they found orphan cubs? Would they be euthanized? Rehabilitated? Released? The answers varied. Sometimes yes. Sometimes no. The fate of the cubs would depend on their age, health, and whether or not they could be rewilded without becoming dependent on humans. That last part sat like a stone in his gut. Because, like it or not, they already were. He tried the local forest ranger office next. Left a message on a scratchy answering machine, carefully vague. No reply came. Maybe the storm had knocked out phone lines, or maybe fate was offering him time to figure out what to do. And then, on the 8th day, something unexpected happened. Jacob opened the door to Fetchwood, and Bran, curious, as always, ambled out into the snow. He gasped, ready to chase after him, but paused. Bran didn't run. He just stood there, blinking up at the sky as snowflakes landed on his nose. He sniffed the air, then turned slowly to look back. And waited. Jacob stepped out beside him. Together, they stood in the snow, man and cub, staring at the same horizon. That's when Jacob saw them prints. Fresh. Big. Too big to be Bran's. Too far apart. Bear prints. Leading away from the cabin. Into the woods. Not toward the shelter from before. But somewhere else. A new trail. Jacob's heart began to pound. Could it be? Could she still be alive? Had she come in the night, unseen, just to check? Or worse, was someone else out there? Another bear? A threat? He didn't know, but he would find out. Because the cubs were no longer just wild creatures to him. They were family. And family, no matter the cost, must be protected. The wind had softened since the night before, settling into a low moan that whistled through the trees like the tired breath of a sleeping giant. Jacob stood at the edge of the porch with Bran beside him, their eyes locked on the trail that hadn't been there the day before. The tracks were clear, sharp-edged in the snow, and unmistakably fresh. Big, powerful prints, far too large to belong to either of the cubs. They curved around the cabin's side, skirted the woods, and disappeared into the thick birch forest where visibility dropped to a blur of white and shadows. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. For a long moment, he couldn't move. The memory of her, battered and bleeding, dragging herself through the storm to his door, was still too raw, too heavy in his chest. Could it really be her again? The possibility stirred something primal inside him. A blend of hope and dread, like the moment before you lift the lid on something you buried long ago. He glanced at Bran, who had stopped moving. The cub's head was tilted slightly, his black eyes focused on the prince, his nostrils flaring. Then, without hesitation, Bran took a step forward. Jacob didn't stop him. Instead, he went inside, bundled Mira in a soft blanket, and placed her gently in the cabin's warmest corner, near the fire. He left food, checked the locks, and stepped back out with his boots laced tight and a heavy coat wrapped around him like armor. The forest swallowed them quickly. The prints were easy to follow at first, especially with Bran leading the way, occasionally stopping to sniff or glance back to make sure Jacob was close behind. They traveled in silence, the snow crunching underfoot like broken glass, the air so still it felt sacred. The forest was hushed, like it was listening, watching, holding its breath for what came next. An hour passed, then another. The trail led through a dense thicket of pines where the snow thinned, protected by the canopy overhead. Branches dipped low, brushing Jacob's shoulders and leaving dustings of powder on his coat. At one point, Bran paused to chew on a low branch, clearly still a cub despite the gravity of their mission. Jacob smiled faintly, the tension easing for a moment. But then the trail shifted. The prints became erratic, doubled back, then veered sharply toward a narrow ravine where the land dipped and twisted through a hollow filled with old fallen trees. Jacob's heart quickened. This wasn't the path of a bear heading somewhere with purpose. This was the path of an animal unsure, maybe even hunted. His mind raced. What if someone else had seen her? What if someone had followed? He gripped the walking stick he'd brought, more for balance than defense, and moved more cautiously. The silence deepened. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. Then they found it. A clearing, no bigger than a backyard, hemmed in by twisted trees and littered with claw marks on the trunks. And there, on the far side, half covered in snow, was a shape. Dark. Motionless. Bran rushed ahead before Jacob could stop him, yelping once in a sound Jacob had never heard before, high and sharp and utterly broken. By the time Jacob caught up, he was already kneeling beside her. The mother bear. Her massive body lay curled, her fur crusted with blood and ice, eyes closed, breath barely visible. But she was alive. Barely. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and her side heaved in slow, labored waves. Bran nuzzled into her, crying softly, pawing at her face as if willing her to open her eyes. She didn't move. Jacob dropped to his knees. The sight unraveled him. How had she made it this far? How had she not frozen, not bled out, not collapsed in the storm? It was a miracle of wild endurance, of maternal will, of something greater than logic. But now she was fading. Jacob knew there was no bringing her back to the cabin. She was too large, too weak, and moving her could kill her faster. She needed care here. Now. And there was no one else. He pulled off his gloves, ignoring the cold, and carefully examined her wounds. Deep gashes along her flank, frostbitten tissue on her hind leg, and what looked like bruising near her ribs, perhaps broken from her fall days earlier. She had given everything to protect her cubs, and now it was time someone protected her. Jacob looked around the clearing and spotted a down tree. He moved quickly, snapping off smaller branches to make a windbreak. He had no supplies, no medicine, no bandages, but he did have fire. He dug a small pit beside her, lined it with stones, and lit a controlled flame using matches from his coat pocket and dry twigs he always kept for emergencies. Soon, the fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the snow. Bran lay beside his mother, resting his head on her chest, refusing to move. Jacob, too, sat close, feeding the fire, whispering words of comfort he wasn't sure were for the bear or himself. As night crept in, the cold returned. But the fire held. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, the bear stirred. Her eyes opened. Not wide, just enough. Enough to find Bran. Enough to see Jacob. Her gaze met his, and in that instant, a current of understanding passed between them so strong it made his throat close. Thank you. It wasn't a word. It wasn't human. But it was there. Deep and sacred and undeniable. And Jacob understood something else too. This was her final place. Not because she was giving up, but because this was the spot she had chosen. A quiet grove, far from danger, close enough for her cub to return. This was where she would rest, not alone, not in fear, but surrounded by those who had not abandoned her. Jacob didn't sleep that night. He stayed by the fire, watching over them, tending the flames. And sometime just before dawn, the mother bear took her last breath. It was silent, peaceful. Her body stilled, her chest no longer rose. Bran whimpered and pressed tighter into her side. Jacob reached out and placed his hand gently on her fur. Rest now, he whispered. They're safe. The morning that followed was one of those rare winter dawns when the sky burns with soft gold, and the forest seems to pause in reverence for something unspoken. The first rays of sunlight poured through the skeletal trees, touching the snow-draped clearing like gentle fingers, casting long, solemn shadows around the still body of the mother bear. Jacob sat beside her, the fire now little more than smoldering embers, and Bran curled up against his mother's side, fast asleep but twitching in his dreams. Jacob hadn't slept. His eyes were hollow but not from exhaustion. He'd stared at the bear long after her final breath had left her body, too awestruck and too broken to look away. The weight of it all, the silence, the sacrifice, The inexplicable trust she had placed in him pressed down on his chest like freshly fallen snow. Not heavy, but constant. Present. He understood now that she hadn't led him there to save her. She had led him there to witness her end. There was dignity in it. She didn't want to vanish alone beneath the snow. She wanted someone to see her as more than just a wild animal, to know that she had tried, that she had fought, and that she had done everything she could for her cubs. And Jacob had seen it. Every step, every wound, every exhausted breath. He had seen her, and he would not forget her. With numb fingers, Jacob reached into his coat and pulled out a worn red bandana, a relic of his father, something he'd carried for years without knowing why. He folded it slowly, carefully, and tied it around one of the lower branches above the bear's resting place. A flag, a marker, a promise that she would be remembered. Bran stirred then, waking with a soft grunt. He stood and nudged his mother's cheek, confused at first. But then, as though something inside him shifted, he stilled. His tiny body lowered into a crouch, and he sat quietly beside her, no longer whining, no longer trying to wake her. He understood too, and just like that, something changed in him. He rose slowly and walked to Jacob, brushing against his leg. It was time to leave. Jacob knelt one last time beside the mother bear, pressed his hand gently into her fur, and whispered, "I'll watch over him. I swear." He meant it. The hike back was quieter than the journey out. Bran trotted beside him, no longer wild-eyed with panic but calm, steady, and eerily aware. The forest, too, seemed changed. Less ominous. Less dense. It was as if the trees had bowed slightly to the passing of one of their own, honoring her for the spirit she had been. Back at the cabin, Mira rushed to meet them, yipping excitedly. Bran hesitated at first, but quickly warmed up to her. The two cubs reunited with the gentle curiosity of orphaned siblings, sniffing and pawing and chasing one another around the porch as if they had known each other forever. Jacob watched them from the doorway, his heart a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. He had expected solitude here. Peace. Escape. What he had found was something entirely different. Responsibility, connection, purpose. In the days that followed, Jacob began to build a second shelter behind his cabin, a den of sorts. He filled it with blankets, carved insulation panels from salvaged wood, and even installed a small heat lamp. It wasn't a forest cave, but it was warm, safe, and hidden from view. It became their home. Bran adapted quickly. He followed Jacob around the property, mimicking him in small, clumsy ways. When Jacob chopped firewood, Bran would sit and watch, tilting his head with every swing of the axe. When Jacob filled the bird feeders, Bran would sit beneath the trees, staring up at the flurry of wings with childlike wonder. But there were moments, often in the early morning, when Jacob would find Bran staring out into the woods, his eyes fixed on the place they had left behind. A piece of him still lived out there. A piece of him always would. Jacob understood that too. One evening, after a long day of repairs, Jacob sat by the fire with Bran curled at his feet and Mira nestled in his lap. He reached for a worn notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer and began to write. Not about plumbing or supply lists, but about her. The bear. He wrote her story. From the moment she appeared at his door, bloodied and broken, to the night she led him through the storm, to the final breath she took beneath the trees. He wrote about her strength, her sacrifice, and her silent trust. He wrote it for himself, for Bran, and for anyone who would one day ask how the boy came to live with the man in the woods. As the seasons changed, whispers of the strange man with a bear cub began to spread through nearby towns. A few hikers claimed to spot a large cub playing in the snow near the tree lane. A game warden came once, curious but kind, and left with only a nod of understanding after meeting Bran face to face. No one believed him when he said the bear remembered him, until they saw what she led him to. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful tales of nature and survival. Thank you. Jacob didn't hide them, but he didn't advertise either. He simply lived. The cabin became a sanctuary not just for Bran and Mira but for Jacob himself. He no longer ran from grief. He honored it. He no longer feared the forest. He belonged to it. And every so often, he would visit the clearing where she lay, clearing the snow from the marker, whispering stories of her cub, and thanking her again. She had come to his door with something in her mouth, a message wrapped in fur and blood and desperation. A message he had answered. A life he had chosen to save. And though the world would never know her name, Jacob did. He called her Grace, because that's what she had given him. And every breath Bran took was a reminder of that gift.